If you spend much time looking at political debates on the internet, you'll see that many leftists and liberals like to point out that they believe they're more intelligent than people on the right. And to be fair to them, you can find studies that back this up. Here's one stating that intelligent people are more likely to be left-wing, although they are using a picture of Jeremy Corbyn. He got 2 E's at A-level, so I'm not sure he's the best example. And they also betray their own pseudo-religious scientism in this article when they say more likely to be left-wing says science. As tends to come up a lot when dealing with left-wing arguments, science doesn't say anything. It's just a tool to figure things out. Research can say something, but science itself isn't this transcendent, amorphous, godlike figure which takes a side politically. It's just a method of figuring things out. But to give the devil his due, as I say, they do have a point. Studies do show that left-wing people tend to score higher, they tend to have degrees more often, and the vast majority of intellectuals tend to be left-wing. So why is this? Now, to get to the bottom of this, you have to understand how leftists think. Here's an answer to this question as to why leftists are supposedly more intelligent on Reddit. This guy states because intellectuals and academics tend to base their position on facts. The right tends to be dominated by dogma, the left less so. Now again, this is highly questionable. The left doesn't tend to base its beliefs on facts. Everybody likes to think that about themselves. The left, if you look in the academic world, tends to base its beliefs around theories and then finds the facts that match said theories. After all, we all know how leftists claim to speak a lot about science when it comes to the environment, but then that science goes out the window when it comes to things like biology. The trans example is the obvious one. Some of them believe you can have 50 genders when of course scientifically there are only 2. Further to that, ironically, some of them will question intelligence testing. They will say it's unscientific, however when it suits their argument, they'll be more than happy to jump on it. Case in point, in the very example I showed you, the subtitle states a new paper has found that higher IQ scores correlated with a range of left-wing and liberal political beliefs. However, when it comes to IQ scores in different domains, and you don't have to be Einstein to figure out which ones, they'll tell you that these things are completely invalid and not to be trusted. So again, they will pick and choose the facts to suit their theory. Yet there is still something in what this fella says when he states the right lean more towards dogma. Now what he thinks dogma is actually tradition. Now it's that tradition that actually works as the safeguard against simply using facts for your own political or philosophical theories. We'll get to that down the line. Firstly, we have to understand, where do ideas of left and right even come from in the first place? Well, it goes back to the French Revolution. All the thinkers and philosophers before that weren't really left or right in the way we think about that today. People like to claim they are, but that's more of an anachronism really. Our modern understanding of left and right came during the French Revolution when the National Assembly would gather and the supporters of the Ancien regime would be to the president's right, and on the left there would be the revolutionaries. Here already we can see the beginnings of rightism or traditionalism, conservatism, etc. versus leftism, that is, liberalism and so on. The traditional model, of course, looks to things such as God and monarchy, natural hierarchy, and most fundamentally perhaps, revelation for its sense of meaning in the world. That revelation is kept alive in traditions and institutions in the church and ways of life and nation and so on. On the flip side, you have the liberal leftist model that is rooted in the 3 core themes of the post-revolutionary French state, that is liberty, equality and fraternity. Now this conception of the state, this conception of people isn't so much rooted in tradition, in God, in monarchy. It's rooted very heavily in rationalism, in the idea of revolution, in looking into how power functions in the world and seeking to undercut it for a supposedly utopian better tomorrow. Famously, that search for a utopia tends to be incredibly violent. We saw that during the French Revolution and during communism in the 20th century, however I'm digressing here. The important point here is that the revolutionaries won, and they won big in the French Revolution. They then took on the intellectual mission to undermine the traditions of the Western world. Now, in many ways, they've largely achieved that. We live now in the almost post-nation state. We are ruled by ideas of equality above anything else. It's also worth adding here, while many people on the right will point to influences like the Frankfurt School undermining the Western tradition, and rightly too of course, they will often ignore the French influence here as well. Many of the main figures in the 20th century in critical theory, that's essentially philosophical wokeism, were French. People like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Althusser, Bourdieu, Debord, Baudrillard and Roland Barthes. If any of you listening out there have done a degree in the past decade or two in anything from philosophy to politics to media, you will have come across these names. They are heavily influential in the modern academic world. Of course, with the history of the French state, it's no coincidence that these thinkers are all French. But there was another thing which really ruined tradition in the Western world in the 20th century. That is, put simply, American materialism. America is an interesting test case here because it mixed together the French ideas of equality, fraternity, liberty and so forth, but it blended that with a sort of relentless drive towards material wealth, a Protestant ethic around hard work. What that led to is a highly materialistic realm, even where the supposed opposing forces of cultural leftism and right-wing economics could work together. Now, I've made content on that odd mix before on this channel, the idea how both communist ideas and capitalist ideas actually are more similar than you'd think because they're both fundamentally material. The tradition of the West is deeper than both and immaterial. That's what's really been forgotten here. Yet what we've seen happen here is what began in the French Revolution. That's the collapse of the divine, the collapse of the religious world, the symbolic world, the collapse of the divine hierarchy which governed the West for so long. Now, on ground level, I can get why that turn away was so simple and so tempting. Look at the 20th century itself. Do you want to go back to the world of stale religion and war, or the new exciting revolutionary world where sex is free, where you can earn as much money and have as much fun as you possibly want? On top of that, you can have a rebellious spirit well into your 60s and LARP as some revolutionary who only wants the best for people. All of that has been encapsulated in 20th century rational humanist globalist liberalism. As we're seeing the liberal world turn in on itself and start to destroy itself at its own roots, many people are looking back to the great old tradition and thinking some of those stuffy old priests and traditionalist philosophers maybe had a point. As many of us realise, we've turned into a soulless economic zone which is full of woke ideology that we've lost something like a heart and a soul, an understanding of who we are and a deeper meaning to life that gives us orientation in chaotic and difficult times. After all, when we look around the modern world and see the decay, the lack of care for our ancient traditions and our ancestors for our descendants, and we see phrases like love is love, what does that even really mean? It means, of course, let people do whatever the hell they want and don't judge anybody ever. Just always try and be empathetic and nice, no matter the situation. It is liberty, equality, fraternity on crack cocaine. And as we're finding out, that's all very lovely and sweet on the surface, great for corporations to market with, but in the long run, that leads to a great sense of decay, a corrosion of the soul, and eventually great pain amongst people in the society because they've divorced love from its root, which is revelation and the ancient tradition. Yet because that ancient tradition is now all but destroyed, even the churches are completely lost in the same woke ideology, there is no recourse for action for many people. All that's left for them is more neo-Marxist theory, more licentious attitudes around sex and so on. And this means we simply dig more into the mind. How can I undermine the tradition even more? How can I prove it's some form of false consciousness to try and finally find this supposed freedom that comes with the liberal mindset? Yet it never comes because the fundamental answers are not in the mind. They're in the heart and the soul and the spirit. They're in duty and service, exactly what our old tradition told us that we've completely ignored. So what I'm getting at here is the instinct of the right is something more than just intellectualism. It's something rooted to a heartland, a soul, a collectiveness, a way of life which guides us. Reason is of course very important, but it's not fundamental. What's fundamental to the right is the adherence to tradition, what the fella at the beginning called dogma. So to answer the fundamental question, why do leftists have degrees and rightists don't? Why are intellectuals always on the left? Well, because it's not a rightist tradition. The whole social academic field in the West is a leftist enterprise. Put simply, asking why are there so few intellectuals on the right is like asking why are there no medieval leftist theologians in the Catholic Church. It's just not part of the tradition, it's that simple. But as I've been pointing to in this video, the right should be buoyed by what's going on in the modern world. It doesn't have a history of intellectualism because that tends to be revolutionary in its scope. Of course, there are academics and philosophers on the right. But what the right prizes more is something more like wisdom. That wisdom may not be as showy and fancy as left-wing revolutionary intellectualism, but it is a lot deeper and it will stand us in good stead for the long term. That's why I believe that increasingly the leftist rationalist intellectual system is going to show its true face more and more. That face is simply worldly power. I believe that reawakening of Western tradition of wisdom is waking up all around Europe. We can see it happening in real time right now, and I do believe it has the power to conquer this liberal globalism. These are just my thoughts, however, do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel.